Hello, and welcome to this Clean Coal Centre webinar. Today, I'm going to be giving a quick introduction to my new report on the impacts of coal mining and transport and the environment. Please note that the report is actually quite extensive in its coverage, and so today I'm only going to be giving a taster of the issues to lure you into reading more. And as I do this, I apologise if I skim over some of the issues. So please do read the report for clarification or ask me questions via the online system at the end of this webinar. The report will be going out for in draft for review in a few days. It complements a previous report I produced a few years ago on coal mine reclamation activities, and that report is available as a free download from our website if you register on there. So, coal mining tends to get a lot of more bad press than good press. By nature, coal mining involves the digging up of vast areas of land, especially when we're talking about open cast coal mining, to access the coal underneath. And this can't really be done without affecting local wildlife, plants, animals, and even local communities. And whilst this can have devastating effects, and there's no denying that it has done in the past, there are many examples of new coal mining activities and techniques which bring employment and a healthy economy to some regions, with mining land being restored and upgraded after the mines close. It's therefore important that we view any new coal mining activities as a new development and learn from the mistakes of the past and work to minimise the effects on the environment. And so this new report summarises how best practice can be carried out. It gives some case studies of where mining has been of benefit to local community, as well as case studies showing how things can go very wrong or very right. So when we consider coal mining, we must consider much more than just the mining activity itself. There's the whole of the transport chain to be considered, and that includes the trucks, the trains, the ships. And there's the potential for dust, noise and nuisance effects along that entire coal chain from the ground from which coal has been extracted through to the final point of its use. And so if we're going to minimise the effects of this coal chain on the environment, then every step of that chain must be evaluated and controlled. And this means coordinating between the mining companies, the coal traders, the utilities and the bulk delivery companies. So later on in this webinar, we'll see a case study of where this whole coal chain has been coordinated to reduce the overall environmental impact. So this is information from upstream emissions, as they call them, of greenhouse gas emissions from all fossil fuels globally. So it looks at coal, oil and gas. But the emissions from the coal sector will be quite significant. And what that is showing is that somewhere between 5 and 37% of global activities from fossil fuel combustion are leading to these emissions. 37% of the global emissions are coming from the activities prior to combustion. So this is excluding any emissions from the coal power sector, just from the mining activities. And that's going to include the emissions from the coal mine, from the methane within the coal seam, but also from the vehicles and the machinery used in the extraction process. Now, these data are from the World Resources Institute, and they note that only around half of the world's largest company actually report these data. More forward-thinking companies are working to standardise the ways to estimate and disclose this information to demonstrate their commitment to the climate issues. But for the moment, data on overall emissions from the coal mining industry and from the oil and gas industry are relatively sparse and rarely reported as such. Now, the data in this slide show the top coal producing. This represents the total amount of coal produced in these countries. If we were to be considering exports alone, then Australia would be top of this list, followed by Indonesia and Russia. But we're looking at total mining production regardless of how the coal is going to be used. However, for those countries exporting coal, the environmental effects of the transport chain are going to be more significant. And that is where data is actually lacking. The emissions effects of the full chain taking export and shipping into account. I found very little or no data on the shipping effects and emissions. So if anyone has information on that side of things, please do email me so that I can add it into the final report. And so in this report, I've gone through the largest coal-producing countries as listed here, looking at the mining practices in each and focusing on the major concerns and challenges what concerns mining companies in one country can be surprisingly different from what concerns a company in another. So let's look at these priorities in the different regions. China, it's not really surprising to see China top of the list of coal producers. It's a hugely growing nation with huge power needs. However, many people are often surprised at just how much the Chinese government is actually doing to reduce the environmental impacts of coal. Poor mining practices of the past have left China with a very poor reputation for health and safety in mines, and dangerous abandoned mines are reported and still an issue in many regions. However, this is changing. The Chinese government is working to close older, less efficient and potentially more risky mines to bring the remaining mining activity into what they regard as large coal bases, where they can coordinate transport and logistics to keep these effects to a minimum, and it makes it easier to monitor and control the actual mining practices and environmental performances of these companies if they're all working in this large coal base area. And over and above that, the government are going and doing retroactive work to make sure that old abandoned mines are being made safe and secure. So a lot of work being done over there. This slide includes very different countries. You have the USA versus India, and it's quite contrasting. President Trump in the USA announced during his running campaign for presidency that he planned to bring back mining jobs to the USA. Whether this is achievable is actually more likely to be a question of the economics of coal production than anything else, especially at a time when indigenous gas sources are profitable and coal imports are relatively cheap. So any effect he has in the mining industry is more economics than actual activity. The Powder River Basin is the largest site of coal mining activity in the USA, and we're going to be looking at a case study from a large mine there later on in this presentation. India is a completely different situation. India plans to bring electricity to around 3 to 4 million of its population who are not yet on the grid. So that's a huge challenge. That's a whole USA looking for power and electricity. Coal mining is increasing as coal will be a significant factor in providing that required power. At the same time, there is increasing public backlash over the removal of farming land, forests and natural habitats, cases of elephants being moved off their natural habitats and other important indigenous species. And the government has recently removed what they call the requirement for public hearings ahead of some continued mining activities, and this is leading to some unrest. The government wants to fast forward the coal permits to ensure that they can produce the coal that they need it, but at the same time they're being accused of neglecting environmental issues as they fast forward these projects. There was a mining incident in India last year which claimed 18 lives in one day, and this has resulted in a very quick tightening of the ranking systems in terms of mine safety, with more of the risky mines being closed down immediately and the standard for safety and health being increased across the rest of the remaining mines. And so this slide alone shows a stark contrast between a country where mining is well regulated and where economics is the main concern, versus a country where mining practices are still potentially a threat to the environment and where economics may actually trump environmental concerns, for the moment at least. Hopefully this will change and India can learn from some information I'll be giving you today. So this is data for Australia, quite advanced country in terms of its mining activities. The policies and legislation relating to mining over there are becoming centralised in the state government level and less at the local level. And this means that over the years there's been a loss of local and stakeholder control over these resources. Some are suggesting that these changes to the Environmental and Planning Assessment Act mean that the public have less power to access information on new projects and to raise objections. And despite this, public action, demonstration and conflicts continue to grow, with blockades at proposed coal mines becoming more frequent. And this is mainly coming from information out of this Adani project. I don't know if you've seen it in the news recently. The proposed new Carmichael mine is to be owned by Adani, which is an Indian company, is intended to produce up to 60 megatons of coal to be shipped from this area in Australia over the Great Barrier Reef and up to India. Now, protesters have raised concerns, with much of this focus being on the potential damage to the already challenged Great Barrier Reef. And the scale of demonstrations is really quite significant down there. Petitions from a large percentage of the Australian population and lots of stuff in the news. The public profile is very high, so high that in fact that some banks are divesting from investment in Adani, and Adani is finding it hard to get funding to get the project up and running. Now, I have to stress that this is just one single project mine that's being proposed that's creating a lot of furore over in Australia. Despite this, it's important to stress that Australia actually has many of the best performing mines in the world with respect to environmental issues. And some of these examples are covered later on in this report. Australia does really set the standard when it comes to mining practice and environmental consideration. Now, this slide shows the information for Indonesia. The Indonesian coal sector has a major backing of the government over there, and therefore it tends to face fewer challenges and objections to any expansion. However, there's still issues with control and compliance. There's a company called Mongabe, an environmental action group, that suggests that over 2,500 mining permits are not fulfilling what is known as clean and clear standards. And over and above this, the official permits, there are around 74 megatons of coal being extracted from illegal mines that are, of course, very difficult to control. And this image shows an example of a site where a coal mine has been closed and abandoned by the illegal mine owners, leaving the area to flood. And although it looks pretty and the locals see this as a potential fishing ground, there's no consideration of potential collapse of the situation, any instability of the land, leaching from abandoned coal waste and topsoil material, which could be causing health and safety issues to the fish stocks and to those eating those fish stocks. But that's an example of a situation where the mining practices are not being overseen correctly. That wouldn't happen in a developed region where the mining controls are quite strict. Now, the Russian mining industry is huge. You're talking about 151,000 people, with 500,000 more involved in energy-related industries. 32 industry-based towns with a population of 1.5 million, 169 coal mining companies, 107 of those are open pit, or open, we call them. They have mining cities such as Vortuka and Novoknetsk. I apologise if I've pronounced that wrong. And they suffer from extreme dust pollution and from rivers in the region which are polluted or very polluted in WHO terms. There's a lot of focus of coal mining activities into these central areas, sort of what the Chinese are doing, but there appears to be limited control in Russia over the environmental effects of these concentrated and extensive industries. There are also concerns over health and safety risks in China, although they are working significantly to improve this. They have zero fatalities and severe injuries initiatives. However, they have situations such as that in the Vortuga region in February last year, where one incident takes 36 lives, and that negates the improved safety records, more as a result of the way statistics work rather than any improvement in the standards of how practice is carried out. It just takes one bad incident to negate a whole lot of hard work in the health and safety sector. South Africa, there's issues with ownership of the land and who has to take responsibility for the mining activities. And there are, of course, arguments that the coal chain is going to benefit from cooperation and communication. And I'll give an example of best practice of communication through the coal chain a little bit later on in this talk. Germany could move towards renewable. They hope to be 50% renewable by 2030, and so unsurprisingly we're seeing a move away from coal and coal production, and a lot of anti-coal protests in the population in China. Conversely, Poland is very heavily reliant on coal, 80% for primary energy demand, and they intend it to, or they admit that it may change that, stay that way for quite a while yet. And so a lot of the population in Poland is actually quite supportive of the coal mining industry, and that's undoubtedly because they are employed by that industry and they have some sort of family income and obligation to the coal mining company. Those companies provide the economy, support the economy, provide employment, and so they're a little bit more supportive of the activities in that industry. Moving on to the more important issues perhaps, that is the regulations and guidelines for land use in coal mining. What do companies have to do to ensure that they're not causing any detrimental damage to the land? Well, there are lots of legislation out there, so it's often better just to look at overall summaries of the legislation and how it's approached. This is the United Nations Environment Programme, voluntary guidelines for activities relating to energy production. And it's a flow chart showing the stages between the definition of the project and the specification of the technologies involved that will carry out the project. The chart flows through consideration of social issues, potential social and environmental effects, to the decision-making process and the associated political analysis, to conclusion of the appropriateness of the proposed plan and whether it should be carried out. The guidelines are broad and they cover the mining of all materials and not just coal, but the aim is to ensure that any emerging economies starting mining for the first time are aware of the importance of considering the issues all through the whole coal production chain, and to ensure that stakeholder and local engagement is engaged from early planning stages. This next slide summarises the legal fields involved in mining. I could cut and paste a whole lot of mining legislation, but it would be not just a single book, it would be a whole series of books, because the coal mining affects land, air and water, and so this is a significant amount of personal national legislation. Each country and each individual state and province has their own relevant directives on land ownership, mining rights, land use, water use, transport policy, air and waste management regulations and health and safety guidelines. And so even before any mining activities can begin, mining companies must consider all these relevant laws, regulations and guidelines to the whole of the mining process. And then they must ensure that they're in compliance with all of them, all through all stages of that mining. And the relevant laws will, of course, vary by project type and project location. And so, unsurprisingly, coal mine planning can take several years. This is a slide produced by the ICMM, that is the International Council on Mining and Metals. They have a wonderful website. I do recommend you check it out, icmm.com, and they provide guidance and documents on best planning in mining, such as for evaluating potential impacts prior and during project development. This chart allows project managers to determine how each part of a project may affect the local environment. Based on this, they can identify which legislation must be adhered to at each stage. For example, many stages of the mining activities affect the concentration of particles in the air, the mining, the blasting, the movement of machinery. To remediate this, mining companies are going to have to evaluate the problem using monitors and models and ensure that any increase in particulate concentrations are below the legal limits. If the limits are exceeded, then obviously they're going to have to take remedial action, which can be achieved by either changing the way they're carrying out the mining practices or by the installation of control systems. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And of course, this analysis and approach must be replicated with all issues, such as water quality charges, waste management, and so on, and with the effects on the local flora and fauna. This is another quite complex chart that I'm not going to take you through in detail. However, it shows a typical plan for mine abandonment. So even before the first area of land has been dug to access that coal, you have up to 5 years, sometimes more, planning on how that mine is going to be closed once it's completed. It must include some form of guarantee or bond, some monetary funding to ensure that the cost of rehabilitation of that mining land is always available, regardless of what happened to the mine. So even if the mine goes bust or doesn't complete its work, that bond or guarantee funding is there to ensure that the land is reclaimed to a level that is acceptable to the local community. So we can see in the diagram that planning for closure is going to start several years before mining commences. In the middle there you have the mining activities, and then after the mine closes, the reclamation activities may take up to or even more than 8 years to complete. This means cleaning of site equipment, the assessment to identify and treat any potential issues with mine land collapse, with negative effects on local water quality. And then there will be several years of settling and re-landscaping, including the reintroduction of indigenous plants and animals. And only once that area is deemed to have returned to a safe and acceptable condition will the mine truly be considered as closed and completed. And this is really what we want to see as in terms of a before and after. The mine site on the left there will be pretty busy and not necessarily attractive during mining, but that's generally a small window. That's only a couple of years where that mine site is going to look that way. But once the coal is out, the site can be made into a green and beautiful site once more. This is an example from 2016, the Alpha Natural Resources Paramount Coal. They won a National Reclamation Award for this coal mine project, which is in Buchanan County in Virginia in the USA. You've got 1,200 acres of site, that's 480 hectares, and it produced coal between 2004 and 2011, over 600,000 tonnes of the stuff. So the reclamation is now complete, and the site on the right includes residential areas, recreational areas, a community park, athletic fields, large playground and gymnasium, as well as industrial and business units. And a recent news article suggests that the native elk have returned to remake their home on the land, which is a beautiful thing. And so mining can and should be a short activity, which has a transient and hopefully overall negligible effect on any location. This is one of my favourites taken from my previous report on coal mine land reclamation. It's called Northumberlandia, or The Woman of the North, and it's an art sculpture created on a closed and no longer used coal mine in a site in Newcastle in England. And it's a demonstration of a rehabilitation of a mine as is intended to produce a legacy or benefit to the community once the activity is finished. It's art created by a well-known land artist called Charles Jenks, and it was created between 2010 and 2012 with the cost of $2.5 million being covered by the mining company, the Banks Group, and the landowner, that's the Blyden Estates, in what they called a restoration first strategy, in that they went into the mining activity knowing that they planned to leave this site even more beautiful than it was when they arrived. At first, the project was refused by the local council, but it was overturned on appeal by the local government. And there was a lot of mixed reaction to this while it was happening. The local community, some of the people loved it, some of the people did not love it. Some complained that the construction of the land art caused a further 150 trucks on the local roads, causing even more damage in terms of construction, noise and dust. But the mine had employed 116 people locally and generated 20 million per year for the local community over its lifetime. And the art was extended to be a sort of reflection on this as an attractive legacy to leave behind to the community. So despite the initial negative press, the site seems to have won over the population. It's won tourism awards, and it's very popular with locals and international visitors. You can Google Northumberlandia.com. It's a free National Heritage Site to go and visit. So moving on, let's look less at the land and more at what happens that goes into the atmosphere around us. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are greenhouse gas emissions from the early part of the coal mining chain, and these can be as much as 37% of the whole emissions from the coal fuel chain. And the emissions are not just coming from the methane released during the mining activities shown in the centre there, but also in terms of diesel vehicles and other mining machinery being used, and the explosions being used to disrupt the topsoil and any rocks and overburden lying over the coal. So although the same gas is the largest contributor to the total emissions of greenhouse gases here, the emissions from vehicles and machinery are not insignificant. And many coal companies are actually working to streamline their coal mining chain to reduce the energy and fuel use, to increase productivity and reduce costs, as well as reducing emissions. And there are a few examples in the report of how this has been achieved, including an interesting study of how the Chinese coal industry could move towards reducing costs at the same time as increasing efficiency and reducing emissions. So please do check that out. This seems to have lost its title, sorry about that, but it is the greenhouse gas emissions from Indonesian coal mining sector. The column on the left shows the greenhouse gas emissions from the various mine chain activities and processes, and the column on the right shows at the fossil fuel depletion. That's the fuels being used at each stage in these processes. So the data suggests that over 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions on the left-hand side in Indonesia are arriving from the heavy machinery being used to remove the overburden. That's the big green chunk there. Clearly, improving the efficiency of these vehicles could help reduce emissions significantly. From the data on the right, it's confirmed that the largest, over 50%, use of the fossil fuels, that is the petrol in this state, diesel, is being used by the machines that are moving the overburden. And so a move towards more efficient vehicles could increase the efficiency. Sea transport is mentioned briefly here, with Indonesia being a big exporter. That's not unsurprising. Haulage and river transport and even crushing and water treatment activities can all give rise to additional emissions which need to be studied and controlled. And this is happening. Here we have a look at a large coal mining company that has summarised the different parts of the coal movement chain as far as they're concerned. They are realising that the productivity can be increased and emissions reduced at the same time if they consider this whole transport chain as a single unit, not just in terms of efficiency and greenhouse gas considerations, but also in terms of dust emissions, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. And then this diagram shows the coal chain in New South Wales in Australia, from the mine to the port via the railway. And along this route, particulate emissions can arrive from the surface of loaded wagons, from residual coal and empty wagons, diesel locomotives, from the roads and tracks, including the entrainment of previously spilled or deposited dust. Dust can blow off from stationary coal piles or via flow off from moving trains and trucks. It can also be generated at every point that coal is lifted and moved along the entire coal chain. Every time you lift coal, a little bit of dust blows off, and every time you move it, something gets dropped, and that has to be monitored and controlled. There are techniques which I discuss in the report. Watering and chemical treatments are available which can seal coal mines, not only when they're stationary, but also when they're in movement. This, another complicated slide, I'm sorry if it's hard to read in your screens. You can look at it in more detail when the report comes out. But it shows the major licences which have been created relating to coal and its transport within the Hunter Valley region of New South Wales and Australia. I did say Australia is one of the places with the examples of best practice, and this proves that. Between 2009 and 2016, several guidelines and initiatives have been established to evaluate areas of concern and to create strategies for control and mitigation of dust releases along this chain. So these include asset design and operation management, as they call it. That's basically selecting the best equipment for each store, operating it correctly. They're changing wagon loading practices. You optimise the transfer between the stockpiles, the weighing machines, the chutes and the wagons to stop blow-off and spillages, and you do it with efficiency and control. Rail transport, as I said, you can use water or chemical suppressants to stop the dust emissions, but they can also optimise the way they drive these vehicles. A slower vehicle is less likely to have coal blowing off. So acceleration can be controlled. Keeping trees and other obstacles on the route will also reduce the chance of coal being blown off or knocked off wagons on the route. Unloading practices and transfer methods are obviously one of the main areas where you can focus. You can keep disruption and leakage to a minimum, and you can do these in controlled and encased areas so that any coal that is dropped or spilled or blown away can be brushed back up again and gained. Cleaning this up is as simple as that. You pick up what you drop and you make sure that you drop as little as possible. It makes sense in terms of coal production efficiency, as well as keeping the place clean and environmentally friendly. Now this picture at the bottom left there shows a coal storage dome built for a stockpile in Tunisia. And there are many of these, lots of them produced by a company called Dome Technology in the USA, provided to several storage places in China. And these domes cover the coal arriving from the mine, and they keep it there until it leaves to cleaning or washing systems and then onto the mills or onto the long-distance transport. And they're there to house the coal while it's waiting to be moved. It has a small footprint because it's quite a tall building, and it's a warehouse that is completely protected from the outside world. The coal can be processed in a first-in, first-out manner so that the residence time is low, and that's going to reduce your risk of spontaneous combustion or deterioration of the coal pile. These structures have no internal support or trusses, so there's no big posts in the middle of this structure here where dust can settle. And this is important because any settled dust can actually act as a sort of miniature coal pile that itself can have explosion or spontaneous combustion risks. These can be almost hermetically sealed, these domes, so that they can actually withdraw all the oxygen and introduce nitrogen in a higher concentration, and that can suppress any issues, so that if there's an indication that a coal's about to ignite, they can flush the whole place out and stop that almost immediately. The whole structure is sealed and seamless. No dust is escaping out of there, and there's no runoff and leaching from any of the coal sitting stationary over long periods. The dust inside the dome is pulled through wet scrubbing systems and fans, so the dust can actually be recollected, it can be combusted, or it can be disposed of, or it can be popped neatly back onto that pile and sold on. It's all very neat and tidy. And this, another example from Australia, is an example of a best practice in terms of dust management along a coal chain. This is the Port Waratah Coal Services, which is a partnership of over 25 organisations in the Hunter region of Australia. It includes the mines, the rail services, the terminals, the port managers, and what they call the Hunter Valley Coal Chain Coordinator. There are 40 mines in here, four main rail haulage providers, 3 loading points and 3 terminals, all to be covered. Now the port has installed all the way through this what they call an intelligent dust management system, which predicts and manages dust emissions based on models that are built around the site itself. This website is easy to check out. It hosts monthly production statistics for the area in terms of coal production and so on, but it also provides 24-hour response guarantee for anyone that has any concerns about the air quality or noise in the region. They post data on their emission concentrations on a daily and a weekly basis. They collect water from the site and they reuse 85% of this for further use on the site. They have an efficiency management plan for the machinery that I talked about that can contribute to these greenhouse gas emissions. And over the past few years, they have had a 10% reduction in the kilowatt hours being used by these machines and reduced almost 16 kilotons per year of CO2 from these machines, which have been improved in terms of efficiency. So a lot can be done by a company that actively goes out there to ensure that they're looking at all areas of their coal mine chain. Looking very quickly at other external effects of coal mining that we don't tend to cover in Clean Coal Centre reviews, so I will just kind of pass through them quite quickly, but they're usually quite interesting in terms of health and social detriments, but also benefits of coal mining activities. For example, this is the noise exposure attained by one individual operator working over a full shift of work at an unnamed mine in the USA, where he's working in the coal cleaning and processing department. As we can see, he's arriving for work early in the morning, and during his day he's passing through control rooms, passing hosing screens and related industrial coal cleaning machinery. And this shows that his accumulated dose of noise is increasing over the day until he eventually leaves via the control room. And at the end of that shift, he's actually passed the recommended dose of 100%, and it's exceeded that. And there are cases where this is happening to some mine workers that are exposed to heavy machinery. There's a way of reducing that and trying to make sure it doesn't happen. You can modify the equipment, put soundproofing on there. You can remove a worker from a noisy area if he's experiencing too much noise. You can adjust shifts and work shift duties to make sure that noise exposure is spread across the workforce fairly. There's also the option to put noise reducing headphones and earphones on there, but in some cases that can be a health and safety risk because the workers may not be able to hear and react to an alarm as quickly as they should. But just wanted to pop that in here to make you aware that coal mining companies are aware that this is an issue and they're dealing with it. Again, to go back to the accident risk management I mentioned briefly earlier, there are still, unfortunately, deaths and accidents happening in the mining industry, and this is due to the uses of large machinery. It happens in any industry that employs large machinery. A lot of work being done, not just in Australia, but throughout the world on safe and health and safety practices, training and education, and just changing the way workers see their working day and react to potential hazards and risks around them. The data here shows absolute and relative values for fatalities in the coal mining sector in the EU, I think it's for 2012 and 2013, with some incidents happening mainly in Spain and Bulgaria that year. However, as I mentioned earlier, these statistics are not a true reflection of the actual average safety conditions from an average mine worker. All it takes is one bizarre accident where several people are killed to skew the statistics. Education and training by coal mining companies is increasing, and a quick flick through recent coal mining magazines will reflect this. Mining companies are receiving awards and prizes for their health and safety initiatives, and hopefully these accidents and risk statistics that we're seeing here will become a thing of the past, and I'm sure they will. Moving quickly on to public perception, obviously this is quite a volatile subject. Some people love coal mining activities. I don't mind looking at a coal mine site. I think it's absolutely fascinating, but I can understand that people do not see the beauty that perhaps I see. These are data from a study in Spain, and the data are a little confusing, so I apologise for putting this complex chart up here. Please do check out the full report for the extended and more easy to follow coverage. But what the data are showing here is the value for social impact from mining on a local community. So this is the viewpoints of the local community as they're polled. So we're seeing on the top there, social impact has a negative number, and this means that mining is seen as having a negative impact on the quality of life. Conversely, however, the relationship with environmental impact is slightly positive, and a positive number there, suggesting that the interviewees were aware of the commitment of mining companies to protecting the environment. Other factors, infrastructure and industry, employment and housing, all had even greater positive relationships, suggesting that sometimes the public appreciate that mining activities lead to employment and community growth. Interestingly, a separate study in the Czech Republic suggests that those under 20 years old and those over 60, as well as those with a higher level of education, are more likely to oppose coal mining activities. The authors suggest that there's potential, huge potential for mining companies to leap upon this and to interact with these areas of the community to engage further public understanding and support of mining research and to change public opinion in a positive way, not just by the information they're giving, but obviously by demonstrating best practice. But listening has to be in both directions. The public can learn that mining activities can be environmentally considerate, but at the same time, mining companies must engage with the public to ensure that they are really dealing with the issues that are of most concern to the communities around them. And so these are some suggestions from the United Nations based on World Bank guidelines on how mining companies in an emerging economy may ensure that local communities engaged even before they start mining and through the mining process. So they need to make sure that the population around them is engaged in the proposed mining work, that they understand correctly what is happening, that's ensuring that the correct information is out there. Sometimes there's an issue with rumours and all sorts of, not false truths, but wrong information being provided to the public. And the more information and more open information that is fed out from a mining company at the beginning of the project, the less likely it is that information is taken out of context. So the local community has to feel that they're engaged, that they're involved, and they're respected at all points of the planning and execution of these mining activities. And they also need to ensure that you've got a fair representation and not just the people that turn up to these perhaps community meetings or bother to send in a letter. You have to go out and engage in the community in terms of ensuring that you've got a reflection of the age across the community, the income, the sex, the education level, to ensure that views of all are considered and not just those with the access to the internet or to the local council. So, excuse me, have a drink of water. Moving on to corporate and social responsibility, CSR. As with all companies, mining companies are required, or at least encouraged, to involve themselves with corporate and social responsibility in the communities that they interact with. And this is just a page from the Peabody website. I'm not promoting Peabody in any way. You can Google any large coal company and come across similar information to this. I simply chose this example as it's from the North Antelope Rochelle mine, which is the largest coal mine in the world. It injects around 175 million into the regional economy, with benefits up to perhaps 2.3 billion in terms of total direct and indirect effects to the community. It's also involved in a lot of safety work and has restored significant areas of mining land. It invests some of its profits back into services for the local community, including, for example, building a state-of-the-art recreation centre with an indoor track and a climbing wall. Now, because of the large amount of mining in the region, Wyoming has received more than $2 billion in coal bonus bids since 1992. And these are paid to the state following the grant of a lease. And this has to be invested in schools, highways and community colleges. And this is a healthy investment in economic diversification as the colleges teach skills that can be used in mining but also elsewhere. And this is going to become increasingly important as mines such as this will eventually close, and the communities that have built up around them are going to see a huge economic impact of this employment moving away unless some alternative form of employment is provided. And so companies like Peabody are already preparing for this to ensure that their legacy on such a community is a good one and not a bad one. Contrastingly, this slide shows the information from CSR activities in an emerging economy such as India. Now, Coal India is a state-owned coal mining corporation through which the Indian government took over the private coal mines back in 1975. It's the largest coal producer in the world, with 7 coal-producing subsidiary companies. Now, there's no single corporate CSR document for Coal India Limited itself. However, it has recently published CSR policy documents in which it provides guidance for the subsidiary companies to do so. And within that, Coal India requires that 2% of the average net profit for the subsidiary company, measured over the previous 3 financial years, must be used for CSR activities. Alternatively, if that information is not available, then the contribution should be 2 rands per tonne, which is about 3 cents or 3 pence per tonne of coal produced. And they suggest that the activities for funding should include eradicating hunger, malnutrition, promoting education, gender equality, animal welfare, protection of national heritage, and so on. The types of CSR activities carried out by Coal India are a little bit distinct from those carried out for companies such as Peabody, but this reflects the needs of each country. But in most cases, coal companies are stepping up with respect to social and environmental responsibility and are reinvesting in local community development, and that's a wonderful thing to see. And so taking all the different aspects of coal chain and its effects on the environment into account, this report does conclude with a few lessons that could be learned by new and expanding coal mining enterprises. Do the groundwork in terms of planning and make sure you involve the local community as soon as you do so. As soon as you plan to make a coal mine, get them involved and consider what concerns them. Look at the mistakes and successes of the past and learn from them. Share your data along every step of the way, because honesty and openness foster trust, as they say. Use social media to your benefit. A few retweets and blogs about how well a reclaimed mine site has turned out can change someone's opinion about a coal mining company overnight. Use Twitter, use 3D head sites, blogs, get down with the kids, as they say. Invest in your staff, not safety and productivity, but also for their happiness and well-being. A mine is more than just a mine. It's a community that grows up around the mine. And happy, safe and rewarded employees in a happy community that will speak highly of your industry. And plan for the day that this is all over. Make sure to clean up any mess you've made, and if possible, make it better. Leave a legacy, leave a positive mark on the environment as you close that mine down. And so my last slide is just the key message. Coal mining can cause devastating damage. Coal mining has caused devastating damage in the past, but times have changed and it doesn't need to happen anymore. In fact, it's becoming increasingly common for mining companies to set examples of best practice at every stage of the coal mining chain. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry that was a long webinar. It's a long report. I'm prepared to sit here for another couple of minutes and answer any questions that you have. Also, while you're typing in those questions, I'll point out that the next webinar will take place on Wednesday the 20th of September at around the same time. The topic and speaker have yet to be decided, but if you're on our mailing list, we will keep you up to date with what is happening. If you're not on the mailing list, I would suggest that you get so, because there's a lot of information we provide free of charge to you. Okay, we have a question coming in. I'll read it out, sorry. We are close to peak coal production. The measures to reduce emissions are improving while the quality of coal produced in some countries is falling. What do you think will be the trend in emissions over the next decade? Best wishes, Ian Reid, who works with us. That is a very interesting question. What Ian is asking here is, although we're at peak coal, so presumably the amount of coal being produced over the years to come will actually decline. But the coal that we're mining now is of lower quality and therefore is going to burn less efficiently and potentially increase emissions to the atmosphere, although that will be dealt with by HELI technologies, and I refer you to other reports. Lower quality coal does not necessarily mean greater emissions. Back to the coal mining chain, I think it's not so much perhaps the quality of coal produced, it's the way that that coal is being produced. So We will see a lot of more open cast, perhaps in some emerging economies in Asia and so on. It's faster and easier to get to. And so that is where most of the damage occurs. Open cast causes a lot more damage to the topsoil in the local environment than a deep mine does, because you've got a smaller area on top of that mine that's being accessed. So we may see a lot more open cast mines and a lot more potential damage to the environment. But as I'm saying, this is a transient case. A coal mine's only going to run for maybe 5, 10, 15 years. During that time, the effect on the local environment can be minimised, and once that mine site is completed, if it's all done properly, then it can be left not only as returned to its original state, or we would hope left as in an even better condition than it was originally, while at the same time having increased the economy and employment in the region. You have to work hard to make a mine site a valuable legacy, but it's absolutely doable, and it's becoming easier and easier looking at the studies I've covered in this report. Any further questions? I don't think so. So as I say, my email address is up there. I am very good at answering emails almost immediately. This is a draft report. The information that you saw there is what I've written so far. If you believe I have any information wrong, that I've misrepresented anything, or you would like to add to that, now is the time to do that. Please do email me on that number there, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I will tune in with you next month to hear the next webinar. Thanks and best wishes. Goodbye.